On September 19, 1984, a group of hunters discovered human skeletal remains near Powell Junction, Idaho, close to the state border of Montana and near Elk Summit. He was discovered wearing glasses with a missing lens. Months earlier, in September 1983, the lens had been found by sheriff's deputies in an abandoned campsite near Powell Ranger Station, about 400 yards from the White Sand Road and about a mile from where the remains were later found. His glasses, clothing, and other items led investigators to assume that he was a military man. Unable to determine his identity, he later became known as Mr. Bones by the sheriff's office, but was not the only John Doe to be nicknamed Mr. Bones in the U.S. No cause of death has been determined, but authorities believe violence was involved because the glasses were broken and the lens was found about a mile away. It was also believed that he had likely died in late 1982, approximately 2 years before his remains were found. Throughout the years, lab staff tried to composite images showing the possible appearance of Mr. Bones. More images made in 1985 showed a more pronounced lower jawline of Mr. Bones' face than in previous pictures. His case was also entered into Dywimas in 2010, 26 years after he was discovered. In 2011, DNA was extracted by the University of North Texas, which determined that he was likely of European descent with a possible admixture of Native American and was likely between the ages of 35 to 55 years old. The DNA profile was uploaded into CODIS, but no match was found. Despite numerous attempts to identify him and numerous comparisons with missing persons, he was never identified. That is, until the Idaho State Police was provided funding in 2022 by Dywimas that would cover the cost of further forensic testing and genetic genealogy. In March 2022, the Autman in-house genealogy team returned a possible identity to the decedent to investigators. Sherry Pope, a potential sister to the John Doe, was located and she confirmed that she had a brother who went missing in 1982. Sherry and her mother, Wilma Bennett, now in her 90s, both provided their DNA for comparison. In April 2022, about 40 years after his death, it was announced that the true identity of Mr. Bones was Roger Brian Bennett of Oklahoma. Roger was born in 1955 in Oklahoma City and was 26 or 27 years old at the time of his death, which was younger than the estimated 35 to 55 years of age. He grew up in Oklahoma and graduated from Blanchard High School in Blanchard, Oklahoma. He enjoyed journalism and was a National Merit semifinalist who enjoyed the history of Lewis and Clark. He was discharged from the U.S. Air Force in Mississippi in early 1982, where his work had involved mid-air refueling. After being discharged from Keesler Air Force Base, he told his family he was going to look for work in the oil fields near Houma, Louisiana before he disappeared. Being a fan of Lewis and Clark and wondering what it would be like to have traveled back in 1804, some believe that he may have attempted to walk in their tracks, but other than that, nobody has any explanation as to why he was in Idaho. On March 4, 2019, a teenage boy was killed in a tragic hit-and-run in the area of Valley Hill Road and Mockingbird Trail in Riverdale, Georgia. It was estimated that he was between 14 and 19 years of age. He had an amateur-style tattoo on his left arm that read Ace and illegible letters tattooed on 2 fingers. His pockets contained 4 lighters, 25 cents, and a container of food. A 20-year-old woman was ultimately accused of hitting him while he was walking, and she left the scene without ever trying to help him. Clayton County Police arrested Jermara Destiny Little in connection with the crash, but they couldn't determine the identity of the boy she allegedly struck and killed around 12:30 a.m. that morning. The arrest warrant said Little was driving her black Nissan Sentra in a reckless manner when she hit the victim, and after the wreck, Little called her boyfriend and waited for him to come to the scene and pick her up, leaving her car and the victim there, and she never called 911. According to the incident report, her car was still on the scene when officers arrived and had extensive damage to the front and rear end. She was charged with first-degree vehicular homicide and hit-and-run later that day. Authorities released a sketch drawn by the GBI's artist from her observations of the victim's face, hoping someone would recognize him in and around the Atlanta area. Police looked into missing persons cases and tried to match his fingerprints and dental records, but no one was a match. However, many people did call in and ask if they could help pay for his funeral or help in any way. Unable to determine his identity, he became known as John Riverdale Doe. 3 years later, in 2022, Dominic Hayes and Chandra Autman were shown autopsy photos of the victim to determine if it was indeed their missing child. At first, his father didn't believe it was him, but then agreed that it was likely his son. At this point, he was officially identified as 15-year-old Dywimas Marquis Autman. Dywimas was originally from Mississippi, and his father, who lived in Georgia, received custody of him months before his death. He says that his son was struggling in school and wasn't going to pass the school year, which highly discouraged him. In early 2019, the year of his death, he ran away from home and was reported missing by his father. He was described as a really smart kid that loved to draw and spoke of earning a degree in criminal justice, but sadly, his life was tragically cut short. In January of 1971, fully clothed skeletal remains were discovered in a wooded area near C.E. King Parkway in Houston, Texas, and determined to be the victim of homicide. It was also determined that the victim was a female, likely between 16 and 20 years of age, and the remains were estimated to have been at the site between 1 and 2 years. She would be buried in the Harris County Cemetery in Houston, and the area where she was found later became the Beltway 8 toll road. In April 2022, 52 years after her discovery, the Missing Persons Department of Houston announced that they had identified the Jane Doe as being Patricia Elaine Thomas-Wardell. Patricia was born July 19, 1952, and had initially disappeared in 1970, leaving behind her husband Charles, an infant daughter, and several older siblings. She was only 2 days shy of turning 18 when she was last seen waiting for public transportation on the corner of Bennington and Hirsch Road after her final class at Durham Business College. Although she apparently intended to be dropped off at home in the 4100 block of Corio in Houston, she likely never arrived. She married Charles Ray Wardell on August 8, 1968, and their daughter Cynthia was born April 5, 1969. Charles was interviewed by police, but it is unclear whether he was ever considered a suspect, and no legal action was ever brought against him. Her height and weight that was given to police was incorrect. Her height was approximately 5'1" to 5'6", although missing person reports listed her as being 5'10" and 160 pounds. The weight estimation was also inconsistent. Her husband filed for divorce, which was granted in January 1973, and he remarried shortly afterwards. Cynthia, who was only 15 months old in July 1970, diligently collected information about her missing mother as she grew up. Private investigators were eventually hired to assist with the investigation, and DNA from family members was collected in 2016. A profile had also been obtained from the remains at least several years prior to this, yet the delay with identification is unclear. Her daughter, Cynthia Wardell, spent 50 years searching for answers to her mother's whereabouts, and her family never knew she was buried just minutes away from where they lived. The Harris County Sheriff's Office is now investigating the murder of Patricia in hopes of bringing her killer to justice even after all these years. A memorial service was held for Patricia on May 5, 2022, and her family hopes that justice will soon be served for Patricia. On May 3, 1992, a farmer named Donnie Lawson was working in a field when he noticed something out of place at the bottom of an embankment. It was located near the entrance ramp from Rural State Road 47 to Interstate 65 in Lebanon, Indiana. It turned out to be the body of a female wearing only a tank top and socks, and her death was determined to likely be caused by strangulation. She had a tattoo that read Mom on her right arm, another one of a cross, and the word love on her chest. Unable to determine her identity and unable to determine her cause of death, she was buried in a pauper's grave outside of the jailhouse in Boone County and became known as Boone County Jane Doe. The next year, her body was exhumed to extract DNA to help determine her age and to send her skull to Michigan State University, where experts were using technology to reconstruct facial features. Images of the resulting sculpture were distributed through the news, hoping that the public could help identify her, but nothing ever came of it. It was, however, determined that she was likely between the ages of 17 and 22. Later, the clay model constructed was placed in the sheriff's office for many years with no tips on her identity. That was until a forensic anthropologist volunteered to determine the young woman's identity. Her body was then exhumed a second time, and isotope testing was performed, which revealed that she may have lived in the northeast or southwest of the United States. In 2020, investigators tried once again to identify her, and this time they partnered with Autman to help. In early 2021, they sent Autman the skeletal remains to build a genealogical profile, and this led them to a Sniegowski family tree. It was also helpful that the victim's sister had uploaded her DNA to a genetic genealogy website. With this new information, authorities contacted a potential brother and sister of the victim who agreed to give a DNA sample to confirm the match. When the sheriff, who was dedicated to identifying her, asked for a photo of their sister, he became overwhelmed with emotions. The DNA testing was funded by 2 Boone County residents, which proved that the victim was indeed their sister who went missing 3 decades ago. On April 13, 2022, it was announced that she had been identified as Margaret Ann Sniegowski of Toledo, Ohio. Margaret was born in 1975 and went by Maggie and was the youngest of 8 children. At the age of 17, Maggie was still in high school when she vanished from her home on Witchwood Street in Toledo. None of her belongings were missing, and there was no clue where she could be. Scared and confused, her family never knew whether she'd run away or been abducted. Her loved ones described her as tough, funny, and a spitfire. They said she loved to sing and was athletic and a fighter. An investigation is ongoing into who is responsible for her death and threw her out over 200 miles away from her home. However, it is highly speculated that Maggie was the victim of Harry Edward Greenwell, known as the I-65 serial killer. His identity was confirmed in April 2022, and he was responsible for at least 3 murders along Interstate 65 in the late 1980s and 1990s. His known victims were women who worked in hotels in Indiana and Kentucky. Her surviving family plans to cremate Maggie's remains and bury her in Toledo with another sister who also died too young. On April 19, 1981, the partial skeletal remains of a young woman were found near Interstate 80 in New Lenox, Illinois. No clothing was found at the scene, and plant growth had concealed the partial skeleton. Investigators believe the body was transported to the scene with a vehicle after her death. The young woman was estimated to be between the age of 23 to 40 years old and appeared to have died up to a year before being found. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Will County Jane Doe or New Lenox Jane Doe. A clay facial reconstruction was created, which the FBI rendered in 2014. A revision was done of the model in 2021, and an age progression was created in 2016. There was evidence that her nose had recently been broken before she was likely murdered. A forensic facial reconstruction was developed in hopes that someone might recognize the young woman. Over the years, over 250 women were ruled out as the decedent. In 2021, the Will County Coroner's Office partnered with Autman to generate new leads that could help identify the young woman or a family member. Autman's genealogy team built out family trees and searched family records to produce investigative leads that were then returned to law enforcement investigators. Investigators performed a search and was able to locate a possible relative to the victim in Georgia who agreed to provide a DNA sample. On April 12, 2022, 41 years later, it was announced that she had been identified as Brenda Sue Black. Brenda was born in 1955 and was originally of Vandalia, Ohio, but moved to California after graduating Butler High School in 1972. Her family had not seen her since 1980. Brenda would have been about 26 years old at the time of her death and was believed to be traveling back home to Ohio when she was killed.